We have chosen the Gothic Bed from the American collection as a representative of an image that is common in all of our lives. It is a place to sleep, a place to rest, a place to heal, and it's a place to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. This Gothic bed was made by Crawford Riddell in 1844 and intended for an historic place. We chose this bed for the class teaching about sympathy, empathy, and compassion because you as a doctor will learn how to understand the roles of suffering in new ways as people do at home in their beds and as they do in the hospital. And also the healing process, which is wonderfully told through the stories that you can remember in your own life. Learning objectives. Learn the differences between sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Learn to observe and analyze works of art and apply those skills to patient diagnoses. Demonstrate your skills at close observation through accurate and detailed descriptions of 3 types of beds: a Gothic bed in the museum, your personal bed, and a hospital bed. Show how you would use empathy in communicating with a sick and recovering patient. Today's class is focusing on 3 very important concepts that you will experience in your medical practice: sympathy, empathy, and compassion. When you see a mother or father holding a child that's in pain or suffering, and you look at their face, you see true compassion. That parent wants to do something for that child, from the core of their body, and they're doing everything that they can. And that is what compassion is about. It is that transformative act of trying to help the healing of others. And it is one of the tenets, of course, of the Buddhist teaching and practices. Sympathy is something we all feel. When we see someone who has been hurt or has had something bad happen to them, and we can understand how they feel. And you'll often say, "I'm so sorry that this happened or that you feel that way." Empathy is a deeper understanding of that. It's actually literally taking yourself and putting yourself in the other person's shoes. It's a deep understanding of the experience of loss or disease or suffering. But the reality is that it's an important part for you as doctors, because if you become truly too empathetic, you burn out. That is something that the medical practice is trying to learn, this fine balance in your lives. And so we're going to talk about meditation. And of course, you've all been in this class where we look at beautiful things. And that is, it's trying to create a world around you that supports you in your clinical practice. This is famously referred to as the Gothic bed. What do you see looking at this? Obviously, it's a bed, but is there anything special about this bed?
Extremely tall.
Extremely tall, right.
Its roof is really pretty.
Pardon?
Its roof is really pretty.
Yeah, the roof, the canopy up there. You're referring to that? That's a canopy. And the wood actually is rosewood, which is extremely rare and comes from Brazil. So this bed was very significant in the time it was made. Every work of art in the museum has an acquisitions folder. The object is coming into the collection, we have to research it. We just can't, just because you thought it was a good idea to give it to us, we can't just take it. We have to make sure it's in good condition. We have to check what's called the provenance and background. We have to know a lot about the work of art. And if it needs conservation, which the bed did, we have to prepare and do that.
The record of the bed and the history of the bed tie in very directly to a patient record, and how a patient who may be sort of broken down and things are sort of falling apart with that person, how we as physicians and as nurses and healthcare providers go about the process of sort of deconstructing what's wrong with that individual, diagnosing what's wrong with that individual, and then making a stepwise fashion to sort of like help rebuild and make that person whole again. And I think that the medical record captures that, and it directly translates with the bed history and the record of the bed.
Where do you think a bed like this would belong? In a palace, but we're in America. What's our equivalent of a palace? Plantation, or what else? Mansion, or what? The White House. In fact, this bed was made for the White House. And it was before Lincoln was elected. So it was made for Henry Clay, who was running for president. And unfortunately, or fortunately, however you feel about these things, he didn't succeed. And his supporters, they commissioned this entire suite of furniture from Riddell in Philadelphia, one of the greatest furniture makers. And then, if you can imagine, he lost the election. Oh. So they had this enormous, bulky set of furniture on their hands. And what do you think they did? Well, yeah, basically you didn't have big auctions like that. They turned to each other and said, who wants this? And one of his friends, Turnbull, who had a plantation, you mentioned that, in Louisiana, the Rosedown plantation, took the entire suite of furniture. In there is the bill of sale, and it was about $2,500 at the time it was sold to come to Rosedown. I can tell you, we did not pay $2,000 for this. And so a miracle happened, and the entire suite of furniture went to Rosedown, and there are photographs in it in the file. But what happened next is it got to Rosedown, and what do you think happened when the owner saw it?
The ceiling was not tall enough.
Correct. Correct. This is like almost 14 feet tall up here. And so even though they had a plantation house, it did not fit. So he had to do the obvious thing, which was build a room, right? And his wife said, we're not giving the furniture back, we're building a room. So an entire room was built and in Louisiana, added on to the plantation. And this entire suite of furniture lived there throughout Turnbull's life and for many generations of the owners of Rosedown Plantation. And there was only one problem. They have, of course, it's Louisiana, no air conditioning, and so when it was hot, what do? They just open the windows. In comes the wind and the dust and the mold. And so over the 100+ years that it was in Rosedown, it fell into very bad condition. It did not, I assure you, look like this when it came. So when it arrived at the museum, we had to figure out what kind of restoration we would do for it. And in the case of this bed, we went to a very famous furniture restorer north of us, and he took apart the entire bed into literally hundreds and hundreds of pieces. And each piece of this rosewood was then hand sanded down, and 11 layers of whatever it's called, shellac were added to it. So as doctors, I mean, it's kind of, I hate to say this, kind of a dermatology. What would you say, when you're rebuilding your skin surface? Resurfacing. This was a major resurfacing activity. So what happened after this was that the entire bed was reassembled and brought to the museum.
Art conservation and conservation of objects, the idea is that we do something, or the conservationists do something to that object, but to the viewer at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, the viewer can't tell that anything had happened to that piece. Everything looks whole, everything looks pristine and intact and as it was previously. And so in medicine, that's always our goal in healthcare, is that, I'm a dermatologist, so if I do something to a patient's skin, for instance, I want to make it look as if I leave no footprints behind, that no one can tell that I really did anything to that person's skin, but it looks better, it looks restored. And I think the same is true in any other specialty, orthopedic surgery. People get their hips replaced. They should feel and act and function just like the native hip might have. So we're often kind of reconstructing humans in medicine, just like bed and other artworks might get reconstructed. And the idea is that they're reconstructed to be whole and to be functional so that the average viewer wouldn't be able to tell that anything was ever wrong to begin with.
In the class of art of observation, that's something that we noticed very similarly when various students will look at the same piece of art, and some of them will look at it as maybe a sad emotion versus a happy emotion, but it was the same piece of art that we were seeing. And that happens in the real world. So I think it's important to realize and understand that what you see is your own perspective, and it's important to get the perspectives of others to get a full picture.
What does bedness mean to you? I mean, it's where people, and especially in this case, made love, and they died, and children were born. A bed is not just an inanimate object. It is a place of being in one's life. And so we look at this so abstracted today and with this pristine red cover. It is much more than that. And when you go in, I just finished 10 days in the hospital with double pneumonia, and I can tell you there is no bed in the hospital that has this level of compassion and memory. You know, people don't do the things that I just mentioned. When you're in the hospital, you're just trying to feel better. And so bedness there, when I came out one time and I came up here to teach, I said, oh my God, I never thought of the bed and its human spirit. And so think of that when you're dealing with your patients. It is much more than just being inanimate or alone. You really have to think about how important it is to be with that bed.
And when you think about the beds that patients are in a hospital setting, they're almost cage-like because they are designed for, not really somewhat patient comfort, but more for patient safety. So, they've got these bars on the sides that flip up and they can prohibit the patient from sort of easily getting in and out of the bed. And there's, kind of all these buttons and controls that can be really confusing. And a lot of times the beds have alarms on them. So if you move a certain way or you do certain things, the bed will beep at you. And so I think for the students to think about what beds are for patients versus what beds are to ourselves and the comforts that they bring is an important exercise for them to think about.
Understanding the role of sympathy, empathy, and compassion by doctors is critical to being successful in their treatment of patients. And the bed is just a marker or a figurehead in this conversation to help remind you of this important role that you have personally in caring for your patients.